Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is the first in a three-part video series on the Olivet Discourse. It will be put in a playlist called Orthodox Preterism, which is a part of my new channel, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The Olivet Discourse. The Olivet Discourse is one of the most important eschatological passages in the Bible. It rivals that of the Apocalypse of St. John, the Revelation of St. John. Here's how I'm going to tackle the problem. I'm going to divide my presentation into four parts. The first two parts will be in this video. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to what the problem is in the Olivet Discourse, and then I'm going to take you through the whole setting in the book of Matthew, showing you that the setting of the discourse tells us that Jesus is referring to the judgment on Israel, not the end of the world, but judgment on Israel. Then in the next two videos, I will talk about the telltale time indicator, the one verse in the Olivet Discourse which tells us when Jesus was talking about Matthew 24:34, when he says, "This generation will not pass away till all these things take place," and all those things taking place was the destruction of the temple. And then we'll talk about in the last video in this series, I'm going to talk about Matthew verse by verse to try to explain the discourse. Now, starting with an introduction here, I will mainly use Matthew 24. I will supplement Matthew 24 every now and then with Luke 21 and Mark 13, but most of the discourse is in Matthew 24. The immediate problem when you read Matthew 24 is, when is Jesus referring to? All these events that he predicts, is he predicting that they will happen in AD 70 or at the end of the world? Now, some of these events are obviously in the present, in AD 70, the destruction of the temple, one stone being torn down from another stone. Some of the events sound like they're in the future, like the sign of the Son of Man appearing in heaven. So which way do you go? Well, there's three possibilities. You can say the whole thing refers to the end of the world, which most futurists do, except for the destruction of the temple. Or you can say that the whole thing refers to AD 70, which is what preterists do. Or you can say that some events refer to the past and some refer to the future. Some refer to AD 70, some refer to the end of the world. I don't think that that's true, because Jesus would be jerking the disciples from one context to another with no indication that he was doing so, and that would be very confusing. So I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to compare the two options, the futurist option, end of the world, versus the preterist option, AD 70. Now, what is the setting of the Olivet Discourse? Well, I'm going to look back in the book of Matthew and divide Matthew up into three parts. The context, the pre-Olivet Discourse context, into three parts. First of all, I'm going to look at all the verses before Matthew 23. And then second of all, I'm going to look at Matthew 23, the chapter right before the Olivet Discourse, extremely important chapter. And then three extremely important verses, the first three verses of the discourse itself in Matthew 24. Actually, it's not the first three verses of the discourse, it's the first three verses that set up the discourse, which starts really in verse 4. All right, well, let's look then at the earlier passages in Matthew 23, which refer to judgment on Israel, which I forgot to mention to you here. All three parts of the context here, there's one theme. Jesus pronounces judgment on Israel. Jesus pronounces judgment on Israel in Matthew 23, and in Matthew 24, he pronounces judgment on Israel. It's not the end of the world that he's talking about. All right, let's look at some passages before Matthew 23. Matthew 3:10, John the Baptist is speaking. He says, "Even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees." He's referring to the judgment that's coming on Israel. A few verses later, 2 verses later, John the Baptist says this: "His winnowing fork is in his hand," that would be God or Jesus, "and the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire." He's talking about the Jews being burned up with fire. AD 70 is when it happened. Matthew 8:12, Jesus is talking about people coming from the east and the west to sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's referring to the Gentiles. But on the contrary, by contrast, the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, which is exactly what happened to Israel in AD 70. Matthew 11, verse 20. Then he, Jesus, began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done because they did not repent. Again, judgment on Israel. He's talking about there, Bethsaida, Chorazin, Tyre, and Sidon were going to be judged. Moving along, still in Matthew, before Matthew 23, in Matthew 21, Jesus during Passion Week is walking from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem, and he sees a fig tree, and he says to it, "May no fruit ever come to you again." And the fig tree withered at once. Why did he do this? The fig tree was a symbol of Israel, a symbol of the wicked apostate rabbinic system that ended up murdering him, and which murdered the prophets from Abel to Zechariah. And Jesus says, "I'm going to curse you, and there's no more fruit going to come for you, because the kingdom is going to be taken away from you and given to the Gentiles." Matthew 21. Again, now we're just talking a few days before the Olivet Discourse. Matthew 21:41. This is still the same chapter. This is the parable of the tenants. Jesus had given the disciples a parable. He says a landowner had a vineyard. He lent it out to tenants, and he went to collect his rent. And the tenants said, "No, we're not going to pay. We're just going to kill your messengers." And so then the landowner said, "Well, I'll send my son." Well, they killed him too. Well, that's referring to the prophets and the Son of God that God had sent to the Jews, and they just didn't care. They killed them, killed the prophets, and they killed Jesus. And so as a result of this, Jesus asked them, "Okay, well, what do you think is going to happen to those miserable tenants?" And the disciples said, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants." In other words, he's going to let out the vineyard to the Gentiles now, and he's going to destroy the Jews. Again, that fits right in with the theme of judgment on Israel. Again, in the same parable of the tenants, Jesus says the kingdom of God will be taken from you, referring to the Jews. You're going to lose it. That's what happened in AD 70. Matthew 22:7. Again, this is another parable, the parable of the wedding feast. The king gave a wedding feast for his son. He invited a bunch of people to come, and they had other things to do. They didn't come, and so the king sent out some more messengers and said, "Hey, how about coming to the wedding feast for my son and honor him?" And this time the invitees murdered the messengers, and the king got angry about that. In verse 7, and he sent his troops, and he destroyed those murderers and burned their city. That is a perfect prediction and prophecy of the burning of Jerusalem in AD 70. So you see how powerfully strong the context is for Matthew 24. But we're not finished. Matthew 23 is even better, in my opinion. It even more shows the context of judgment on Israel. In this chapter, Jesus pronounced the 7 woes on the Pharisees. In verses 13, 15, 16, 23, 25, 27, and 29, he pronounced the 7 woes. He calls them blind guides in 2 of those verses and hypocrites in 6 of those verses. Here's just a summary of the chapter to save time. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe, woe. Judgment is coming. Now, moving to the end of verse 23, chapter 23, we see Jesus pronouncing judgment on the Pharisees. Matthew 23, verse 35 through 36. On you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth. Punishment for all the people you've killed. All these things will come upon this generation. All what things? All the woes that Jesus finished pronouncing on them in chapter 23. And all those woes will come when? Upon this generation. Well, this generation, Jesus is speaking in AD 30, a generation is about 40 years. That means within 40 years, these woes are going to come upon these Pharisees, this generation. So remember that key phrase, this generation. It will show up in the Olivet Discourse. All right, so moving along in chapter 23. Still staying on that same verse, talking about this generation. Notice that this generation does not refer to an unspecified generation at the end of time. Futurists love to do that when they get into Matthew 24. They say, oh, Matthew, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. That's referring to some generation at the end of the world. No, this generation is referring to Pharisees who were existing in 30 AD when Jesus was speaking to them. Now, let's compare that key verse in Matthew 24:34. Jesus says in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. All what things? The destruction of the temple. We'll show that later. He's referring to their house being left desolate and the one stone being taken from the top of another stone, and one stone won't be left on top of another. All that's going to take place, as well as all those other judgment things, the wars, the famines, the rumors of war, the great tribulation, all that stuff is going to happen before this generation takes place. Futurists cannot explain this verse. They just cannot. C.S. Lewis could not explain it. Nobody can explain it. Now, dispensationalists love to take verses literally. Well, let's take this verse literally. This generation. How literal can you get? I'll take this verse literally. I believe I'm much more literal than any dispensationalist, any futurist ever will be. Now, the things of the Olivet Discourse are going to take place before this generation passes away. But still talking about the context in Matthew 23, we can see that he's referring to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, because in Matthew 23, verse 38, he says, see, your house is left to you desolate. House, that means temple. The temple is a house. Your temple is left to you desolate. Desolate means destroyed. And this is the next to the last verse, right before the Olivet Discourse. All right, now let's look at the first 3 verses of Matthew 24. This is the last of the setting passages. I'm going to show you the last of the contextual passages. We're going to start with the first 2 verses, Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. Jesus left the temple and was going away. Now remember, just in Matthew 23, we talked about the house, and so we're still talking about the house, the temple. Jesus left the temple and was going away when the disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The reason the disciples were probably pointing out the stones is because Jesus had just told them in chapter 23 that the house would be left desolate, and the disciples said, what? You came here to set up a messianic kingdom and you're saying the temple's going to be destroyed? Jesus, are you nuts? Are you crazy? That can't be. Look at these stones. Look how big they are. And Jesus said, look at here, my friends. Not one stone's going to be left. Not one stone's going to be left on top of another that's not going to be thrown down. Now, Jesus is clearly referring to this temple here. So I've got here in red here, as you can see. The temple here in red. The temple here. It's not referring to some hypothesized rebuilt temple at the end of the world. He's talking about the temple there in Jerusalem. Now, Jesus' disciples, upon hearing that the temple is going to be destroyed, and this, of course, is running against their inclinations and their biases, they asked Jesus 3 questions. Now, they asked these questions in verse 3, and I've got the 3 questions distinguished by 3 different colors, blue, green, and gold. So let's look at these 3 questions. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And these things refer to the destruction of the temple, because that's what he was just talking about. When will the destruction of the temple be? Question number 1. Question number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? And question number 3, what will be the sign of the end of the age? Now, here is where all the controversy starts. If you are a typical futurist, what you will do is you'll say, okay, question number 1, the one in the blue about the destruction of the temple, well, obviously that was AD 70. But, or at least I say obviously, some futurists might even go so far as to say this is the destruction of the rebuilt temple in the future, but I don't know. I'm not an expert on futurism. I would hope they wouldn't say something that ridiculous, but I think most futurists would say that the first question is referring to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But now the second question, what will be the sign of his coming, the sign of your coming? Futurists just assume coming means the second coming of Jesus at the end of the world. Preterist, orthodox preterist will say, no, that's referring to the sign of Jesus' coming in judgment upon the temple in Jerusalem. Not that we orthodox preterists don't believe in the return of Jesus bodily at the end of the world. We do believe that. We just say that this is not what is being talked about in this particular discourse. Question number 3, the disciples asked Jesus, what will be the sign of the end of this age? Futurists say that it's the end of the world that the disciples are talking about here, the end of the world. In fact, the old King James English translates that as world instead of age. The ESV has age, and that fits the preterist interpretation, which says that the disciples are wondering about what's going to be the end of the Jewish age, because if the temple is going to be destroyed, that's the end of the Jewish age, because the temple was the symbol and epitome of Judaism, and it's going to be gone, so that means the end of the age. So there's your rub right there. Question number 2 in green, question number 3 in gold. What will be the sign of your coming? Is that the end of the world, or is that 80-70? Question number 3, what will be the sign of the end of the age, 80-70, or the end of the world? Now, let's don't get lost in futurism, okay? The 3 mistakes that will mess you up and get you into futurism and get you in a bog so that you'll never understand eschatology, and you'll end up being a pan-millennialist and saying, I just don't know. The first mistake is making those 3 questions refer to 2 different times, 80-70 and then end of the world. If you will make all 3 of those questions refer to the same time, you avoid a lot of trouble. Mistake number 2 that futurists make, interpreting coming as the second coming. Coming does not have to be second coming. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It is not a technical term for second coming. It just means coming. You have to go by the context to know what coming is talked about. And the third mistake that futurists make, that you can make and get yourself into trouble by following futurism, is translating end of the age as end of the world. That is not a good translation, as I'll show you in a minute. It's end of the age, not end of the world. All right, so let's look at futurist mistake number 1. Making the 3 questions refer to different times. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the parallel passages in Mark and Luke and see that Mark and Luke collapse those 3 questions into one question, and that one question is obviously referring to the destruction of the temple in 80-70, and the question about the sign of your coming and the end of the age is not even in those parallel passages. All right, so let's look at the parallel passages. Matthew 24:3. Mark 13:4 says this, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now, these things, I've underlined, put it in blue. When the disciples use that phrase, they're referring to the destruction of the temple. Remember, that goes back to verses 1 and 2 in Matthew 24, when Jesus talks about the temple being destroyed, and the first question, the blue question in Matthew 24, verse 3, the disciples say, well, when will these things take place? When will these things be? So when they're talking about these things, it's talking about the destruction of the temple. And in Mark, the disciples say, when will these things be? When will the destruction be? And when will be the sign when all these things, the destruction of the temple, are about to be accomplished? No mention of Jesus' coming, no mention of the end of the age, just what will be the sign that these things are going to take place? Because the disciples were not asking a question about the end of the world. They were asking a question about the end of the Jewish regime. It's just as simple as that. Let's go to Luke 21, verse 7. And they asked him, teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Again, these things refers to the destruction of the temple. And so there's no mention of the sign of Jesus' coming or the sign of the end of the age, only the sign of when will of these things that are about to take place, the destruction of the temple. So the age here, the sign here is referring to the destruction of the temple. And let me just anticipate a little bit. The sign, when you see sign of the end of the age, is the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple is the sign of the end of the age, because when you see the temple destroyed, that will tell anybody, hey, that's the end of Judaism. That's it. It's over. So that's what the sign is. It's not about the sign of Jesus coming in the sky at the end of the world. All right, let's look again at, still continue to look at futurist mistake number one, making all those three questions refer to the same time, refer to different times. This is a logical argument, okay? If Mark and Luke are talking about the same discourse, and Matthew in that discourse is mentioning one of the most important events of all history, which is that Jesus will be coming back and the end of the world will be here. I mean, that's what they used to call second coming headlines in the newspapers. When the second coming is going to be here, it's going to be some big headlines, big event. But Mark and Luke don't even mention it. Well, the reason they don't even mention it is not because they don't think the end of the world is a big deal. The reason they don't mention it is because that's not what the disciples were asking about. That thought was far, far, far from their mind. They weren't thinking about it. It beggars belief. It beggars credibility to think that those disciples were asking about the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus, because the reason they weren't is because they said straight out, when will these things take place, the destruction of the temple? All right, still continuing with futurist mistakes. Here's futurist mistake number two about this passage, interpreting coming as the second coming. Coming, parousia, is not a technical term for the second coming. Now, this is easy to prove. I'm just going to give you one example just to prove it real quickly. 2 Peter 1:16. Peter says this, "For we did not follow cleverly contrived myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Instead, we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Peter there clearly talks about the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ in the past, made known to you in the past. He was referring to the transfiguration, not the second coming. So, whether that word is second coming or not depends on the context, and I've been trying to show that the context here is overwhelmingly AD 70, the destruction of the temple. The context has nothing to do with the return of Jesus at the end of the age, which I do believe in, but I don't believe it's being talked about in this particular passage. Now, here's another logical argument why the disciples could not be talking about the coming of Jesus at the end of the world, is because they had no concept of that. They had no concept of the resurrection of the dead, and if they could not conceive of Jesus as rising from the dead and going up to heaven, they certainly couldn't conceive of Jesus coming back from the dead, or coming back again to the earth. So, to prove that, let's go back, and this is standard New Testament interpretation. Let's go to Mark 9:10. "So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean." The disciples didn't know what rising from the dead meant. They didn't understand until after the fact. Luke 18:32 through 34 says this, "For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise." So Jesus clearly said, "I'm going to get killed and I'm going to rise again." How did the disciples respond? They understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. And I submit to you, they didn't understand any better during Passion Week than they did when this Luke 18 was spoken. They did not understand Jesus dying and rising from the dead. All they could think about was a Jewish messianic kingdom. When they talk, "Lord, when will you restore the kingdom?" They're thinking Jewish. They're thinking the messianic kingdom. They're not thinking about Jesus' second coming at the end of the world. There is no way they could have been thinking about that, not if you want to be logical. All right, futurist mistake number three, translating end of the age as end of the world. Now, this is important because if you translate what is the sign of your coming at the end of the world, well, that obviously sounds like the end of the world. That's the way the King James does it. But if you say at the end of the age, that favors preterism because we're talking about the end of the Jewish age, the end of the age where Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish apostate kingdom. Now, what's the better translation? Well, I looked up 24 translations, English translations of the word. The word is ion, and of those 24 translations, 16 translated the word as age and 8 as world. There's another word that could have been used there, cosmos, a Greek word that means the physical world, the end of the physical world, but it wasn't used. was used, the word for age, and the better modern English translations have age there. And I can understand why world might be used there, because when a Jew saw the end of the temple, they would think it was the end of the world, because that was the end of their world. But when we read it, we think of the physical earth. And so that's not a good translation. It's the end of the age, not the end of the world. All right, so that ends this section of this 3-part series on the Olivet Discourse. I hope you'll stay tuned, sign up for my channel if you would like to subscribe, and continue in the study of the Olivet Discourse with the next 2 videos.